The deed was signed on a Tuesday in late August 1888, a transaction that the clerk at the land office in Cheyenne viewed with a mixture of pity and confusion. The plot of land Mara had chosen was not the fertile bottomland near the creek where the grass grew thick enough to graze cattle, nor was it the flat expanse near the railhead where a storefront might prosper. Instead, she had purchased 20 acres of a rocky, exposed rise that the locals called the Anvil, largely because the wind hammered against it with such ferocity that it seemed intent on flattening anything that dared to stand upright. The price was low, suspiciously so, but the clerk took Mara's money all the same, sliding the paper across the counter with a look that suggested he was taking advantage of a woman who clearly did not understand the geography of the territory. Mara, however, did not look like someone who made mistakes out of ignorance. She was 30 years old, her hands were calloused from years of labor that she rarely spoke about, and her eyes held a quiet, unsettling focus that discouraged idle chatter. She took the deed, folded it precisely into the pocket of her duster, and walked out into the dusty street where the town of Cheyenne was busy erecting tall, false-fronted buildings meant to mimic the civilization of the East. The town's judgment was swift and loud, rippling through the general store and the saloon within hours of her departure toward the ridge. The common consensus was that Mara had lost her mind, or perhaps she was simply a spinster who had grown too strange for polite society, and was seeking a place to wither away in isolation. They watched as she drove her wagon up the incline, the wheels groaning under the weight of supplies that made no sense to the casual observer. Sacks of lime, rough-hewn timber that looked too short for a proper house, and shovels, far more shovels than one woman should need. Among those watching was Thomas, a ranch hand with a reputation for being as steady and unexciting as a fence post. He had known Mara for 6 months, mostly through brief exchanges when she came to town for supplies, and he had developed a quiet, lingering fascination with her stoic independence. While the other men laughed about the hermit witch on the hill, Thomas felt a knot of anxiety tighten in his chest, a sense that she was walking into a trap set by the landscape itself. He rode out to see her 3 days later, finding her not building a frame, but digging a hole. "You're burying yourself before you're even dead," he had said, leaning over his saddle horn, his voice gruff with a concern he didn't know how to express softly. Mara paused, leaning on her spade, the wind whipping strands of dark hair across her face. "I am building for the wind, Thomas," she replied, her voice flat and matter-of-fact. "The wind takes what stands tall. I intend to stay low." The architectural logic Mara employed was offensive to the sensibilities of the era, which favored height and ornamentation as signs of prosperity. A proper house in the territory was built of sawn lumber, painted white or yellow, with a porch for sitting and a high-peaked roof to shed the rain. Mara's design was a rejection of this entire philosophy, born from a trauma she kept locked behind her teeth, a memory of a winter in the Dakotas, where she had watched a proper house shatter under the weight of a blizzard and the screaming wind. She measured her life not in social standing, but in British thermal units, though she wouldn't have known the term. She knew only the bone-deep ache of freezing and the physics of survival. She marked out a square that was shockingly small, a mere 12 feet by 12 feet, a dimension that the town gossip, Mrs. Gable, declared to be hardly fit for a root cellar, let alone a Christian woman. But Mara was not building for comfort or for guests. She was building a fortress against temperature. She spent the first 2 weeks doing nothing but digging, sinking the floor of her future home 3 feet into the hard-packed earth to utilize the ground's natural insulation. The skepticism of the community deepened into mockery as the walls began to rise, or rather, as they failed to rise in the expected manner. Instead of a single layer of timber, Mara constructed 2 parallel walls with a gap of 10 inches between them, a technique that wasted precious wood in the eyes of the local carpenters. She spent agonizing days mixing a slurry of mud, straw, and dry moss, packing this dense mixture into the cavity between the walls. It was back-breaking work, the kind of labor that bent the spine and stripped the skin from the palms. yet she worked with a rhythmic, almost mechanical efficiency. She was creating a thermal break, a dead air space packed with insulation that would hold heat even when the outside temperature plummeted to 30 below. Thomas returned a week later, bringing a sack of nails he claimed were extra from the ranch, though he had bought them new that morning. He watched her packing the mud, his brow furrowed. "It looks like a fortress, Mara," he noted, dismounting to inspect the thick, ugly walls that lacked the grace of a clapboard home. "It looks like something a badger would build." She didn't look up from her work, her fingers caked in the gray earth. "A badger survives the winter," she said, tamping down the insulation with a piece of scrap wood. "The peacock freezes." Her refusal to explain herself fully, to justify her strange little box to the town, only fueled the rumors that she was mentally unwell, but Thomas saw the precision in her movements and felt a strange pull toward the sheer competence she displayed, even if he couldn't understand the end goal. By late September, the physical toll of the construction was becoming visible on Mara's body, transforming her from merely capable to gaunt and hardened. The wind on the ridge was relentless, drying out her skin until it cracked and bleeding the warmth from her extremities even on sunny days. She woke before dawn, her muscles stiff and screaming in protest, and worked until the light failed, eating cold beans and hardtack because she was too exhausted to build a fire. The project had become a war of attrition between her will and the geology of the ridge. She had to haul rocks for the foundation of her fireplace, dragging them on a sled she had fashioned from scrap wood because the wagon horse was too skittish to navigate the steepest part of the slope. Every stone was a battle, a test of leverage and friction, and she moved them with a grim determination that bordered on obsession. The town of Cheyenne had largely lost interest, writing her off as a failure waiting to happen. But occasionally a carriage would pass on the road below, and she would see the occupants pointing up at her squat, windowless structure, their faces obscured by distance, but their judgment clear enough. The isolation was absolute. There were no neighbors to lend a hand with a heavy beam, no one to hold the other end of a measuring tape. It was just Mara and the wind, which seemed to resent her intrusion more with each passing day. Thomas continued to visit, his excuses becoming thinner. He brought fresh eggs, then a distinct type of oil for a lamp, then simply himself, claiming he was checking fence lines that were nowhere near her property. He watched the structure take shape, a low, ugly block of timber and mud that seemed to hunch against the horizon. During one visit, he found her struggling to lift a header beam for the doorframe, her boots slipping in the loose scree. He stepped in without asking, taking the weight of the wood, his hands brushing hers. The contact was brief, electric, and immediately suppressed by both of them. "You're going to kill yourself up here," he said, his voice tight. "And for what? A box that looks like a coffin?" Mara wiped sweat from her forehead, her breathing heavy. "It's not a coffin, Thomas," she said, her eyes meeting his with a ferocity that startled him. "It's the only thing that's going to be standing when the sky falls." He didn't believe her. The sky was clear and blue, the autumn mild, but he couldn't leave her to struggle alone, so he stayed for the afternoon, driving nails in silence, bound to her not by belief in her vision, but by a terrifying fear of what would happen if she failed. October arrived with a sudden, violent drop in temperature, the kind of meteorological shift that warned old-timers that the coming winter would be a punisher. The air grew thin and sharp, and the ground froze hard overnight, making any further digging impossible. Mara was behind schedule. She had the walls up and the insulation packed, but the roof, the most critical and dangerous part of the build, was still just a pile of lumber on the ground. She needed to construct a heavy, reinforced truss system to bear the weight of the snow she knew would pile up on the low-pitch design, but she was exhausted, her reserves of energy depleted by months of solitary labor. She was working on the ridge pole, balancing precariously on the slick, frost-covered top plate of the wall, trying to leverage a heavy pine log into position. Her hands were numb, her grip compromised by the biting cold and the fatigue that made her limbs feel like they were moving through water. It happened in the silence of a Tuesday morning. Mara shifted her weight to drive a spike, and her boot found a patch of ice on the timber. She didn't scream. She simply gasped as the world tilted. She fell 10 feet, not a fatal distance, but she landed badly, her right leg twisting beneath her with a sickening crunch that echoed loudly in the stillness of the ridge. The pain was immediate and blinding, a white-hot spike that shot from her ankle to her hip, stealing the breath from her lungs. She lay in the frozen dirt inside the unfinished cabin, the sky staring down at her through the open roof, vast and indifferent. She tried to stand, but the leg collapsed under her, sending a fresh wave of nausea through her body. She was alone, miles from the nearest doctor, with a storm front visible on the northern horizon, a dark bruise against the blue. She dragged herself to the corner where she had piled her tools, the agony making her vision swim. This was the moment the town had predicted, the inevitable failure of a woman who thought she could outsmart the wild. She curled into a ball, shivering not just from the cold, but from the shock, realizing that the house that was supposed to save her might now become the place where she died. Thomas found her 4 hours later. He had seen the storm clouds gathering and had ridden out with a sense of urgency he couldn't explain, a premonition that something was wrong on the ridge. When he arrived and saw the empty work site, his heart hammered against his ribs. He found her huddled in the corner of the unfinished shell, her face pale, her teeth chattering violently. When he saw the swollen, purple discoloration of her ankle, his expression shifted from fear to a controlled, simmering anger, not at her, but at the situation. "I told you," he whispered, kneeling beside her, his large hands gentle as he inspected the injury. "I told you this place was cursed." But he didn't try to move her to the wagon immediately. He saw the unfinished roof, the darkening sky, and he understood the calculus of the situation better than she expected. If they left now, the interior would fill with snow, ruining the insulation she had slaved over, destroying the work. "We have to finish the roof," Mara gritted out, her voice trembling but resolute. "If we leave it open, the moisture will rot the straw in the walls. It will all be for nothing." Thomas looked at her, at the tears of pain in her eyes, and then up at the heavy timbers waiting on the ground. He thought she was mad. He thought the cabin was a fool's errand. But looking at her, broken but unyielding, he realized he loved her too much to let her work be destroyed. "You can't walk, Mara," he said sternly. "You can't lift." "I can instruct," she countered, gripping his arm, "and you can lift." For the next 6 hours, as the wind began to howl and the first stinging pellets of sleet began to fall, they worked in a desperate tandem. Thomas became her hands and her back. He hoisted the heavy timbers according to her precise, pained instructions, grunting with the effort, while she sat propped against the wall, calling out measurements and angles, fighting to stay conscious. It was a brutal, intimate dance of instruction and execution. He didn't understand why the trusses had to be spaced so closely, or why she insisted on a triple layer of waterproofing tar, but he did it because she asked, driving the nails with a fury that matched the approaching storm. By the time the last plank was nailed down and the door was hung, night had fallen, and they were both sealed inside the dark, small space. It was cold, but the wind, which was now screaming outside, was suddenly silenced by the thick, insulated walls. Thomas struck a match to light the kerosene lamp, the small flame illuminating the tight, strange little room, and for the first time he felt the stillness she had built. The blizzard that descended upon the Wyoming territory that night was not merely a storm. It was an atmospheric correction, a violent rebalancing of pressure that sought to scour the landscape clean of human intrusion. Within an hour of Thomas closing the heavy insulated door, the world outside ceased to exist in any recognizable form. The wind, accelerating across miles of open prairie, slammed into the ridge with the force of a derailment, screaming around the corners of Mara's squat, ugly structure. Inside, however, the sensation was disorienting. Thomas stood by the small cast-iron stove, his hands trembling slightly as he lit the kindling, waiting for the walls to shake, for the roof to groan, for the inevitable draft that plagued every ranch house he had ever known. But the draft did not come. The silence in the room was heavy and absolute, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the muffled, distant roar of the wind, which sounded less like weather and more like a heavy freight train passing a mile away. He looked at Mara, who lay on a pallet of blankets near the interior wall, her face gray with pain, but her eyes alert, watching him. "The coal," she murmured, gesturing to the small scuttle. "3 lumps, no more. The space is too small for waste." Thomas hesitated. In the bunkhouse, they threw logs into the fire by the armful and still shivered in their bunks. To use 3 lumps of coal against a storm of this magnitude seemed like madness, yet another symptom of the delusion that had built this box. But he did as she asked, feeding the black stones into the belly of the stove and latching the door. By midnight, the logic of the coffin began to reveal itself with undeniable clarity. In a standard house, heat is a fugitive thing, constantly fleeing through thin floorboards, rattling windows, and high vaulted ceilings that trap warmth where no one can feel it. But Mara had built a thermal trap. The sunken floor, 3 feet below the frost line, utilized the earth's constant temperature to moderate the extreme cold. The 10-inch cavity filled with mud and straw acted as a barrier so effective that the interior walls remained cool to the touch, but never cold. The small square footage, which the town had mocked as a pauper's hovel, meant that the single stove pressurized the room with heat almost instantly. Thomas sat on a stool, peeling off his heavy sheepskin coat, sweat beading on his forehead. He looked around the cramped, dim space, realizing with a sudden, jarring shift in perspective that he was not in a trap, but in a machine designed for exactly this moment. The storm outside was registering temperatures of 20 degrees below zero, capable of freezing exposed flesh in minutes. Yet inside the air was steady, dry, and almost aggressively warm. He looked at Mara, who had drifted into a fitful sleep, her chest rising and falling rhythmically. He realized then that she hadn't built a house. She had built a weapon against the winter, and for the first time he felt foolish, not for being there, but for ever having doubted the woman who was currently unconscious on the floor. The storm raged for 3 days, a white hurricane that buried the territory under 5 feet of drifting snow. Inside the cabin, time dissolved into a strange, suspended loop of maintenance and quiet intimacy. Because the cabin was windowless on 3 sides and the snow had drifted over the single south-facing pane, they existed in a perpetual twilight, illuminated only by the golden glow of the kerosene lamp. Thomas tended to Mara with a clumsiness that slowly refined into care. He boiled snow for water, the pot hissing on the stove, and made a poultice for her ankle from the dried herbs she kept in labeled jars. The intimacy of the space forced a proximity that their previous courtship, if it could even be called that, had never allowed. There was no room for pretense in a 12-by-12 box. He saw the grimace of pain she tried to hide when she shifted. She saw the worry etched into the lines of his face when the wind gusted particularly hard, a phantom fear that the roof would tear off. But the roof held. The truss system, ugly and over-engineered, bore the crushing weight of the snow without a creak. They spoke little, the silence filled by the physics of their survival. "The air is getting stale," Thomas noted on the second day, panic edging into his voice as the heavy air pressed on his chest. Mara pointed to a small sliding vent near the floor and another near the ceiling, a passive ventilation system she had installed to cycle air without losing heat. "Open the bottom 1 inch," she instructed, her voice raspy. "Physics will do the rest." He obeyed and felt the fresh, cold draft rush in, chasing the stale heat out the top vent, a lung breathing for the house. The psychological toll of the confinement began to press on Thomas by the 3rd morning. He was a man of the open range, used to horizons and distance, and the feeling of being buried alive was becoming claustrophobic. He paced the 3 steps across the room, checking the stove, checking Mara, checking the door that refused to budge against the snowpack outside. "How do you know it stopped?" he asked, staring at the ceiling boards. "I can't hear the wind anymore, but that could just be the snow insulating us." Mara sat up, propped against the wall, her leg elevated on a sack of flour. "The temperature," she said, pointing to the thermometer she had nailed to the door frame, a rare and expensive instrument. "It's dropping inside. That means the wind has stopped stripping the heat from the outer walls, but the ambient cold is settling. The storm is over. The freeze has begun." Her certainty was terrifying and calming in equal measure. She didn't guess. She measured. Thomas looked at her, seeing not just the woman he wanted to protect, but a partner who was currently protecting him with nothing but math and mud. "When we get out of here," Thomas said, his voice low, "I'm going to have to apologize to you about the badger comment." Mara looked at him, a faint, rare smile touching her lips. "Don't apologize," she said softly. "Just help me dig." Digging out was an act of labor that rivaled the construction itself. The door opened inward, another specific design choice Mara had insisted upon, knowing that an outward opening door would be sealed shut by drifts. When Thomas pulled the latch, a wall of white, hard-packed snow stood before them, a solid block of ice and powder. He attacked it with the shovel, carving a tunnel upward toward the light, his breath pluming in the rush of cold air that finally invaded their sanctuary. It took an hour to breach the surface. When Thomas finally popped his head out of the hole, the brightness of the sun reflecting off the endless white expanse was blinding. He squinted, his eyes watering, and pulled himself up onto the roof of the cabin, which was now level with the snow surface. The world had been erased. The fences were gone. The road was gone. He looked down toward the valley, toward the town of Cheyenne, and saw only the peaks of roofs and the dark smudges of chimneys struggling to breathe. But it was the silence that struck him most. There was no movement, no cattle, no wagons. He turned back to the hole, reaching down to help Mara as she hopped on her good leg, her face pale from the effort. He pulled her up into the blinding day, holding her steady as they stood on top of her home, 2 dark figures against a blinding white canvas. "We're the only ones up here," he said, the realization hitting him. "And we're the warmest things on this mountain." The descent into town 2 days later was a slow, grueling procession. Thomas had fashioned a sled from the remaining roof timber to drag Mara, as her ankle could bear no weight. They moved across the crust of the snow, which had frozen hard enough to support the sled, but broke occasionally under Thomas's boots. As they neared the outskirts of the community, the devastation of conventional wisdom became apparent. The Gable House, a 2-story Victorian beauty that had been the pride of the county, had suffered a partial roof collapse. The steep pitch had shed the snow on one side but held adrift on the valley side, torquing the frame until it snapped. Smoke was thin and sporadic from the chimneys they passed. When they reached the general store, the center of public life, they found a huddle of men trying to clear the boardwalk, their faces wrapped in scarves, their movements sluggish with deep, bone-chilling cold. When Thomas dragged the sled into view, the men stopped. They stared with open mouths, not just because Mara was alive, but because she looked rested. She wasn't frostbitten. She wasn't shivering. While the town had spent 3 days burning furniture to keep their uninsulated, high-ceilinged parlors above freezing, Mara and Thomas had sat in a 60-degree box, drinking tea and waiting. The silence from the neighbors was different this time. It wasn't the silence of judgment, but the silence of a paradigm shattering. The vindication of Mara's crazy cabin did not come with a parade or a public apology speech. The frontier was too proud for that. It came in the quiet, practical admissions of defeat that followed in the weeks after the thaw. It started with the blacksmith, a man who had loudly joked about Mara's gopher hole coming up the ridge to ask about the mixture she had used for the wall insulation. He didn't say he was wrong, he just asked for the recipe. Then came Mrs. Gable, humbled by the loss of her roof, asking how Mara had calculated the snow load. Mara answered them all with the same flat, unemotional precision she had used to build the place, drawing diagrams in the dirt, explaining thermal bridges and wind shear. She didn't gloat. She didn't need to. The reality of the blizzard had argued her case better than any words could. Thomas, for his part, never returned to the bunkhouse. He spent the spring expanding the cabin, not upward, but outward, following Mara's strict rules of thermal efficiency. He built a second room, low and thick-walled, connected by a heavy door. They married in May, standing on the flat, ugly roof of their home, the wind whipping their clothes. The town still called the place the Anvil, but the tone had changed. It was no longer a joke about stubbornness. It was a respectful nod to the only thing on the ridge that the wind couldn't break. And years later, when new settlers arrived and asked why the houses on the north rise were built so low and thick, the locals would simply point to the ridge and say, "Because the pretty ones fell down, and the ugly one is still warm."